Good morning. My name is Nikolai. I'm a member of Learning Lab, and I want to welcome you all to this annual teaching day. It's such a wonderful thing to see how many people showed up, and I must admit it might also give us some challenges with the seatings. So I mean, well. But let's try to see if we can make it work anyway. The theme of this year's teaching day is PBL, current practices and current and future practices. And first of all, I would like to thank all the presenters making this day possible. I'm very happy that you have agreed to present your work today. And I would also like to thank all the people involved with arranging this day, especially Janne and Katrine and Dorte, who's sitting outside. They have worked tremendously hard to make this day possible, so please don't hesitate to send them a smile while you walk outside the door after this first session to have your coffee. I hope you all have received your program. It's lying outside on the table, and next to the table at the board, there's a list of all your names with the workshops that you have elected. So if you cannot remember which workshop you have signed up for, you can check it out on the board. Finally, I just want to make a little bit of. I want to tell you that this the first session here today, the keynote session, will be video recorded, and the video will be up on Learning Lab's webpage, so you can go and visit anytime you like. Also, I want to tell you that at our webpage, Learning Lab, there are a lot of courses, pedagogical courses, that you as members of AAU can sign up for. And there are also a lot of resources, and Catherine has asked me to give some examples. For example, these 3 booklets that are open for download, and they are easy read and very hands-on pedagogical tools that you can use in your daily work. Also on the webpage. And with this, I would just like to say again, welcome, and I hope you'll have a wonderful day together. And I'd like to give the word to Inger, that will do the formal introduction of the day.
Thank you very much, Nikolai. Wonderful to see so many people attending this event today. Good morning, everyone. And welcome to the annual University Teaching Day. A special welcome to our keynote speaker, Maggi, Savin-Baden, who will help us launch the topic of this year's Teaching Day, PBL at Aau University, Current Practices, Future Directions. As always, I've been very much looking forward to this event today, and I'm very pleased to see that so many of you have chosen to come here together with me and get inspiration and input to reflect on PBL in theory and in practice. As stated in the invitation, it's important that we maintain a reflective stance on PBL and our own PBL practices to continuously develop our PBL competences. We must be able to embrace the world of tomorrow and the students of the future. Also, the future landscape of universities in Denmark is debated these years. It's of great importance that we, as a university in Denmark, stand out and become unique. And we must convey the significance and the value of our PBL approach, of what we call the Aalborg model, both positively to influence politicians, but also because we believe it matters as a learning model. Just recently, we were recognized for being the university in Denmark with the absolute best cooperation competences, and for our candidates that excel in the transition from the university to the real world. When they step out from the university, we often hear from Danish industry, other industry corporations, that they take on their position as from day one, that they, with great ease, become part of a new work environment. And this, we believe, is a reflection of our PBL approach. And not only do we believe this connection, we want to find out more. As you probably know, we have launched the new strategy for Aau University, Knowledge for the World. And in the strategy, we emphasize our dedication towards PBL, and specifically on researching into the effects of PBL. It's our ambition that the principles of PBL continue, of course, to form the primary pedagogic foundation for all our teaching activities at the university. But it's also important that we constantly strive to improve and consider the impact of new types of students, new facilities, and not least new technologies, and how all this may affect PBL at Aau University. I hope that you will use this day as an opportunity for reflection on how you use PBL in your own teaching activities, and also to assist us all in investigating how PBL can be further strengthened in our practice, the current practices and new practices. And last but not least, a big thank you to the organizers for putting this event together. I know it's been hard work. It takes a lot of effort to hire people, to engage in combining the program, setting up the venues. But thank you so much for Learning Lab for doing this for us. And now I'd like to direct our attention to the theme of today's event, PBL at Aau University, current practices, future directions. And with no further ado, I'd like to say welcome again, and I hope we'll have a fantastic day together, and we'll enjoy the day, especially on a day like this, wonderful spring weather. So welcome everybody. And Nikolai, can I ask you to introduce our keynote speaker? Thank you so much.
Yes, it's a great privilege to present our keynote speaker today, the lady I've been dining with the last 2 days. And Maggi Savin-Baden is a professor at Worcester University. I've been practicing now for 2 days, and I'm probably going to get it right at some close. She's a professor at education and a well-renowned scholar, working with educational practices and especially PBL for the last 30 years. Yes, and I think it's pretty safe to say that she is one of the most cited authors and theorists in PBL literature, also in the PBL literature springing from Aau University. And she's been a great inspiration for many of us working with PBL at Aau University. So I'm very much looking forward to this keynote speak, even though I might have a clue of what you're gonna say, but so again, you're very welcome, and I'm looking forward to this day.
Thank you. And you can keep that.
And I'm going to keep this because
I'm just looking that there's some spaces here, and I wondered if you wanted to shuffle up and let the people who were struggling on the steps have a seat. Okay. Great. That better? Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. I've been watching Aau University for many years in terms of what you've been doing. So it's kind of good to know that you found some of my stuff useful. Today I'm going to do a talk which you might know quite a lot of this already. If you do, I apologise. Some of it might be a little bit controversial. It's all right, I've already apologised to your Pro-rector that I might be causing a bit of upset. And so let's just see how it goes. I can't remember how many slides in it is, but certainly about 10 slides in. I'm going to stop and I'm going to ask for some questions. It was a result of something yesterday when I did this talk, which is going to be slightly different today. And what actually happened was the guy said I'd gone a bit too fast. So I thought, well, if I stop and ask for some questions, then maybe it will slow me down and give you a chance to think. Does that sound all right? Okay, good. The first problem we've got is with the title. I don't quite know how the crossover happened, but this title was kind of one that was taken from a paper, but this was the actual title that I sent. Because I think it's a bit more exciting than the 21st century. The Fault in Our Stars, Constellations of Problem-Based Learning. And it's kind of useful given that, you know, Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, I live in Warwickshire. You know, I just thought, well, maybe, except that's probably from Julius Caesar, not Hamlet. Anyway, the Constellations of Problem-Based Learning. And I want to talk about liminality, living with the liminal. So a bit of introduction really about me first of all, because a lot of people on mainland Europe find it difficult to know where I am and where Worcester is and how you pronounce it. This is Worcester, cathedral city, very small provincial university of about 12,000 students. And it's here, that's where it is in the UK, so that's where Worcester is, so it's quite near the Welsh border. And I actually live a county or two over in Warwickshire. And me, what do? I bake. I like baking. These are a few of my creations here, but I do like baking. If I didn't climb, I'd probably be a few stone heavier than I am because of my baking. But I also have two teenagers, Anna and Zach, who keep me on my toes and keep me informed technologically, and a husband and a dog that I run with. So that's us in Paris at the Paris Park Run. So that's just something, a little bit about me before we set off. People think that if you write lots of books, you haven't got a life. I do. Okay, so let's set off. So what I'm going to talk about is the constellations of problem-based learning that we see across our world. And I'm going to talk about engagement in that. I'm going to talk a bit about participatory pedagogies later, but I'm going to talk most of all, I think in the second half of the talk, about threshold concepts and transdisciplinary threshold concepts. But when we look at what we do in PBL now, I think one of the problems that we've got worldwide is that we have become quite not regimented, but we still hold on to some of the premises that we started with. When I first started using problem-based learning in 1986, there was one book, and then soon after, David Bowd's edited book came out. And so there weren't many models of doing this thing. There wasn't a lot of pedagogy about it. And there wasn't a lot of pedagogy because it was developed by medics. So we often, I think, include at the moment formal things like lectures and seminars, virtual learning environments, which I think are very linear and rigid. And we include things like reading lists. And to some extent, we still assume that we've got to get this content into the heads of our students, that they are a blank slate, a tabula rasa, waiting to have it filled by their own wisdom through project-based and problem-based learning, but also through us too. Whereas I think what we need to be doing is more peer-led, even more than you're doing now, more peer-led. I think we need to be doing creative things like getting them to use mashups. Are you familiar with mashups here? Oh, okay. Well, it's where you do creative pieces, where you do a bit of a lecture and a bit of music, a bit of content, some pictures, and you bring it all together to give an account of something. So I think we can use these kinds of things for assessments. I think we need to use more shared knowledge, and we need to acknowledge there's an awful lot of hidden learning that happens outside that's often left at the classroom door. I think we need to recognise that our students are digitally tethered. They wear their devices anywhere. And I wrote a book a few years ago about rethinking learning in a digital age, and it stemmed from the idea that I could see these teenagers wearing their devices. The classic story about this was the book started because my daughter, who was then 14, was wearing her phone in her bra, as were all her friends, so they could hear it vibrate. And they would excuse themselves from the classroom at school and go to the toilets, check their texts, follow up the messages and go back into class. Okay, so they are digitally tethered. And I think this is one of the things where it's a bit of a balancing act between acknowledging all of this, enabling our students to use their technology in the classroom, and telling them to turn their phones off and leave it behind. I taught a group of second-year students fairly recently, and I walked into the classroom and they thought, oh, who's this old woman who's going to talk to us about digital research? And so I said to them as I walked in, Friday afternoon, they clearly didn't want to be there. I said, get out your iPads, get out your phones, get out, Google what I'm talking about as I talk. And they looked at me, you know, like I was from the moon, you know. And I think it's this thing about people forget how important it is to be tethered to our technology. And I would define digital tethering as this constant interaction and engagement. The sense of always being on, always being engaged. Wearing your mobile device, texting at dinner. We didn't do any texting at dinner last night. Catherine didn't have to tell us to put our phones away, which was quite nice. Or driving illegally while Facebooking. The University of Worcester, I drive down the M5 from where I live, and what actually happens is there are great big lorries coming down the sides of the motorway, and they're filled with police officers who are looking into people's cars to check whether they're using their mobile phones. So that's how bad it's got in the UK. So what about constellations of problem-based learning? As I'm sure you know, there probably are as many versions of problem-based learning as there are stars in the sky. And I'm sure what happens in this university is that what happens in one classroom is not the same as what is happening in the classroom next door. And therefore I think we need to rethink what we mean by project-based and problem-based learning. And I think what's interesting about this, I don't think this is a bad thing that we've got so many versions of it. I think it shows the value across the world of the value that's placed on this form of learning, how much it has grown and how much it has changed. I certainly know when I completed my PhD in 1996, it had changed hugely. And when I'd started off trying to find research sites in 1990 to even get access, there were only 5 places in the UK that were using PBL. And that's not that long ago, really. But I think one of the problems we've got is there is not a lot of understanding of the different constellations and the impact they have on students. And you look at it, and people talk about problem-based learning, inquiry-based learning with an E, project-based learning, and nobody kind of knows what the difference is. And I think that's a problem, because it does make a difference to what you're doing with your students. So I'm going to do that thing that everybody hates. You know that thing when somebody says, you won't be able to read this slide, and you all groan and think, well, why did you put it up in the first place? Well, I'm going to do that in a minute, but it's because it's on page 3 of your handout, and I want you to be able to look at the one on page 3. So while you get ready, I'll just say that the idea of locating different formulations of PBL, these are not, you'll notice the diagrams has got lines. Is it page 3? I'm right. It's got lines across it, but the problem with it is that there aren't really lines across it. There's overlap between the different approaches. But it just gives a sense of constellations. So this is the diagram I want you to kind of take away and think about, but I'm actually going to talk a bit about the different ones in a smaller well, not a smaller diagram, an enhanced diagram with some of these taken off. So when you look at this diagram, if you look at Constellation 1, problem-based learning for knowledge management, I still see this, a lot of this, in things like computer sciences, engineering, where people are using problem-based learning in order to manage the knowledge, to get the body of knowledge across. And the idea is that it's very discipline-based. It can be quite directive, and it's about testing of knowledge when you do assessment. So the whole emphasis of the learning is about managing the knowledge, so using problems to manage and understand the knowledge. Constellation 3 is something that you maybe do more of at Aalborg, because it's project-led, it's led by a project team, it's knowledge that transcends the discipline, and the focus is very much on the completion of the project. Whereas if you're moving into a different constellation, things like problem-based learning for critical understanding is about being much more critical. So we were at Constellation 6, I think. And this is about knowledge with action. It's about seeing uncertainty as a positive thing, about recognising epistemological gaps. And so what your assessment is on is about capabilities across different contexts. It's not about competencies, which I think are quite narrow, and I know that you've been talking about this, and also when I was at Copenhagen yesterday. I think we need to ditch competencies because they're too narrow. I think we need capabilities. And if you read the work of Ron Barnett, he guides us through that process of shifting from competencies to capabilities. So I think what Constellation 6 gives you is a synthesis across disciplinary boundaries, so that knowledge is less siloed, and you see how you can transcend the disciplines. The one I guess I like most of all is Constellation 9, because it's much more disruptive. It's kind of based on the work of Paulo Freire, Jacques Mezereau, Bell Hooks, and it's about seeing alternatives. It's about unpacking, why do you teach the stuff the way that you teach it? I asked that of somebody yesterday, and they said, well, I don't know that I've bothered about the question. But I think it's an important question to ask ourselves. Why do you teach what you teach the way you teach it? It's about embracing things like disregarded knowledge, when to stay silent, when not to stay silent, when to be supportive and when to be critical. And it's about looking at the cultures, what is really going on in this classroom, and is what is going on in a history classroom the same as going on in an ICT classroom? It won't be the same because of the disciplines. But I think that's what's quite interesting. I think it needs to be more flexible, more student-led, and it needs to be about interrogating frameworks. So when we think about these different constellations, I think there's a challenge ahead of us to think about how we might think about creating problems for problem-based learning, or encouraging students to think about projects when you're doing project-based learning. And I think one of the things that's quite interesting in all of this is it came about through my dinner with Nikolai and colleagues when I was in Copenhagen on Tuesday evening. And we encountered this problem in the restaurant, and we asked ourselves, what problem is this designed to solve? So this was in the restaurant, and we were all like, well, what's this for? What do you do about this? But it's just an interesting thought. It's an interesting question. Is it Constellation 9? I don't know. But, I was saying yesterday, the only thing you're going to remember from this talk now is the 2 toilets. So I'm going to stop there with a beautiful picture of your skyline from last night and say, having said all that stuff about problem-based learning, who has got a question? But I'm going to ask you to ask a question. I don't want a paragraph of reflection first, I just want a question in a sentence. So who's got one of those? There's a microphone just coming.
Hey, I want to ask you, you said you were giving a lecture on Friday afternoon, no one was listening, so I want to ask, why did you tell them to put all the digital devices out and interact with them during the lecture?
Because I thought that it would help them to concentrate better on a Friday afternoon. I thought it might encourage them to look at what I was talking about rather than falling asleep. And I thought if I was giving them references or referring to things they didn't know about, they could look them up while they were sitting there. Okay. Any other questions? Annette.
Thank you, Maggie. One question. Could we combine your Constellation 3 and your Constellation 9?
Yes, you could. I look forward to seeing what it looks like. Constellation 10, no doubt. This is only a model. Models are useful to a degree, but it helps us to think and question. So yeah, let's have Constellation 10, with or without toilets. Okay, so we'll leave that there for now, and I'll just keep thinking about your questions, because there'll be time at the end. But yeah, I was very nice skyline last night, lovely. The next thing I'm going to talk about is threshold concepts. How many people here are familiar with threshold concepts? Two, right, well forgive me, because you'll know all this. The idea of threshold concepts came out of some work that was done in the UK back in about 2000 based on a large research grant. And Mayer and Land argued for the idea of a threshold concept, the idea of a portal that opened up when people got stuck in learning. All right? I talk about it as disjunction, but they talk about it as a threshold concept. So the idea is that you might encounter something that you don't understand. So in physiotherapy it might be pain, in economics it might be opportunity cost, in culinary spheres it might be the temperature and what the kind of pans that you use in terms of conduction. So those kinds of things would be threshold concepts. Things that people don't get. I always remember in economics, they said, how much is the price of a bun? And I thought, well, where do I start with this? You know, that was my threshold concept in economics. So how might we see these? A lot of people see threshold concepts as a great big wall, you know, struggle to get through. Other people see it as an interesting way of looking at learning, you know, with a top, a middle and a bottom. And other people see it very much as a portal, as a way through, a place to review the issues. And I don't agree with all these characteristics of threshold concepts, but these are the ones that they argue for, that they're transformative. So once you've engaged and understood the threshold concept and you've gone through the portal, there's a big shift in the way you see things. They're irreversible. The idea is that you can't go back over the portal, but I'm not sure that I agree with that one. They're integrative. It helps you to understand more things than the thing that you were just struggling with. And they're bounded. Again, I'm not sure I agree with that either. So the new space entered has frontiers and borders with other threshold concepts. And finally, that they're troublesome. David Perkins talks about troublesome knowledge. I think that's a great way of seeing knowledge, troublesome knowledge. But it's they're difficult to teach, threshold concepts, and they seem counterintuitive. And I know certainly when I was first using problem-based learning back in 1986 and 97, a lot of my students used to get cross with me. They used to get stuck because they didn't get this way of learning. So I think in many ways problem-based learning in itself is a threshold concept. That's why I think the link between the threshold literature and problem-based learning is so important. Because what problem-based learning is produces this business of being stuck in learning. How do I get through this stuckness? How do I understand what I'm supposed to be doing here? But in recent years, there's been a shift away from the idea of concepts. There's been a lot of discussion and people saying that actually it's not about concepts. Concepts are too cognitive. So there's some work by Gina Whisker and some I did on writing journeys and PhD research, where students start to make, instead of just a concept, they're more like learning leaps. So you suddenly get through and understand and make a huge shift. The classic one for me is when you see students doing PhDs, they're analysing their qualitative data, and it's all in lots of lists, and it's all in categories, and they've put it through NVivo, and they've coloured it with felt tip pens everywhere, and it's all a bit of a mess, and they suddenly make this leap into understanding that it's not about analysis, it's about interpretation. And that's a big learning leap in PhDs. There's a recent one by Caroline Bailey on threshold capabilities, which is about thresholds within professions. I'm still struggling to kind of understand what these mean, these threshold capabilities. I find the paper a bit difficult to follow, but it's something to do with thresholds in professions. And then the last one is threshold concepts which are transdisciplinary. This came out of some work that I've been thinking about for about 8 years, and eventually I wrote the paper. And this is about concepts that transcend the discipline and subject boundaries, which are challenging and complex to understand. And I think you see these most in problem-based learning more than anywhere else. So they're concepts which transcend subjects and disciplines, and they allow the students to understand things in a much more coherent way. And if they can't get this together, they struggle to progress through the curriculum. So there are 4 of these, and again, one of them may be a little bit controversial. So I'm going to say that liminality and scaffolding, pedagogical content knowledge and pedagogical stance are the 4 that I'm going to talk about. So liminality, again, how many people here are familiar with liminality as a concept? Yeah, quite a few, okay. Liminality is a betwixt and between space. So it's like you've gone into the tunnel, you've crossed the threshold, and you've gone into a tunnel, and you haven't come out, and the tunnel is the liminal space. And I think liminality is a threshold concept because quite often staff and students don't realise the importance of liminality for learning. That it's important to get stuck, it's important to struggle. I was telling Nikolai, I was working with a group of first-year students some years ago, teaching them research methods, and one of them said, "Maggie, how did you become a professor?" And I said, "Well, I failed at school." And it's through failure that I've come to the place that I have. It's through the struggles. And I think it's important for our students to understand that. Scaffolding, now this is very controversial. Most people like scaffolding. Most people like to structure everything. They want to help their students to do that. But I think it's a problem, scaffolding. I think students believe and tutors believe that they must provide it, they must have it. But I think it's like competencies. I think it needs to go in the bin. All right, I think we need to get rid of scaffolding. Because actually, you can over-scaffold the learning and prevent disjunction from happening. And so they can't get over the threshold. So I think scaffolding. I read an article by Cindy Jiménez Silva, who again, many of you will know her work. And she's all about scaffolding, the best scaffolding for problem-based learning. I was going, no, we don't want to do that. So I think we should get rid of scaffolding. Pedagogical content knowledge. I think this is knowledge that is specific to the subject that we're teaching, and I think we need to be very careful with that. A lot of students who come think that in order to think like an engineer, you need to cover all the content, but I think you don't always have to cover all the content related to engineer to be able to think like an engineer. The trouble with pedagogical content knowledge is that it's too bounded. It's got too many boundaries around it. And actually what needs to happen is we need to be working in transdisciplinary ways. And finally, the 4th one is pedagogical stance. It's the way we see ourselves as tutors, the way students see themselves as learners. I was at Oxford a number of years ago, and I said to a group of students, "How do you learn best?" And they said, "We don't even understand the question." Now, for me, that's a slight worry. But I mean, my guess is that you ask that of your students. But also, do you ask it of yourself? How do you learn best? How do you teach best? What is your stance towards learning? And I think what you see is that the different ways, different types of pedagogical stance are transdisciplinary threshold concepts, because they're often stages which the students pass on their way to deeper forms of learning and engagement. So I think we just need to be careful that we encourage disjunction, stuckness and liminality, and we don't over-scaffold, we don't keep the knowledge too bounded. So the liminal tunnel, I've mentioned a little about the liminal tunnel. So you get stuck, you go over the threshold and you find yourself in a liminal tunnel. Now what's quite interesting about both problem-based learning and the threshold learning literature, threshold concepts literature, is that people haven't really looked at what's been going on in the liminal tunnel. And that's now starting to come to the fore. And I think it's quite an interesting space to look at. And I've got a PhD student in Stockholm who's been doing a little bit of that work. And so we've been having great arguments about what we think goes on in this liminal tunnel. And so this again is in your sheet if you want to look at it. But the idea is what actually happens here? You move into the tunnel, and then how do you get out of it? And again, I think we're not really sure, but this has been, so Angelica started this work and I've kind of taken this table on, and we've got a paper in review at the moment, but I think there's another one coming as well. But I think it's about what triggers the movement inside the tunnel. How do you move towards the end of the tunnel, and how do you get out the tunnel the other end? So I think there's some interesting work to be done around the shifts in and through the tunnel. But I also think it's quite interesting is that most of the time we talk about the liminal tunnel, and I think maybe what we'll be talking about is a rhizomatic tunnel. So you go in and there are numbers of different pathways. Or somebody yesterday said maybe it's a maze. I hope it isn't a maze, because I think we'd be really stuck then. But I think it's this idea that there are multiple ways of dealing with this. I also think that's quite interesting, a lot of the criticism about the threshold concepts is that it's been too cognitive and not ontological enough. And I think that's the other thing that looking at the liminal tunnel helps us to think about. People within the tunnel begin to re-examine their position, and it's not always a cognitive one, it's more likely to be cognitive and ontological. So the idea of the ontological liminal tunnel is movement from one place to another, and taking up a new position, not just pedagogically, but personally as well. So maybe we need to do a bit of rethinking our learning. You may be deeply worried about this picture. This is my husband. I was already across this bit. But I think one of the problems with learning is that it wobbles like a wire. You think you've got it, you think you've sorted it, you think you've got it all sorted out, you've got it organised, and then you get, can we mix Constellation 3 and Constellation 9 together? And of course you've got a wobble. And I think that's one of the things that's really exciting for me about working in university, that because the learning changes all the time, because it moves like the wires as you're going across, your hands are going, then your feet are going, and then are you going to fall off? I don't think we fall off too often in universities, but I do think we need to do some rethinking. I think we need to see learning as embedded across geographies as well as physical and virtual realms. It needs to be more participatory. We need to have participatory pedagogies so that home and school and work and leisure and play become spaces of learning. And they're critical and they're creative. I don't think learning a module or even just doing a project is not enough anymore. I think we need to do things differently. I think we need to recognise that our digitally tethered students are under-researched. We don't really know what is going on. We don't know how much peer teaching is happening out of school, out of the classroom. And the way the technology is used is markedly different, I think, in different schools and different universities across Europe. I think what we need to be doing is shaping learning so it enables students to do problem management, to become digital citizens whose desire is to mess around with stuff, to transform their lives. And I think the learning in different spaces needs to leak across these different boundaries of home and work and play and exploration. And so I'm a great fan of Steve Fuller. If you're not familiar with Steve Fuller's work, he is prolific, to say the least. He has a minimum of 20 books, and I couldn't even begin to count how many papers, but he writes some really great stuff. He's a sociologist with an interest in education. And I think, you know, for me, this is kind of a bit like Fuller. He's got a flying brain, you know. And he asks, what difference does a university make if everything produces knowledge, or is in the business of knowledge production? He argues for the importance of the lecture and suggests that many academics don't really understand its premise. The idea is that a lecture shouldn't be something that you can carry on reproducing. It shouldn't be something that you capture or that you do the same one every year for your students. It's about creating a space for learning to occur. And he says it's not just about passing on knowledge. It's about the exploration of wisdom and knowledge. And he talks about it as sapere aude, the dare to be wise and a dare to know. So this sense of daring in learning. So not just stuckness, but a sense of daring, of disruption and interruption in the way we do our lectures and our teaching to our students. So some of the things I think we need to be aware of, I'm not sure whether I talked about this yesterday, whether you have benchmarks in learning. You have benchmarks in learning? Yeah? I think we need to be careful about benchmarks. I think they need to go in the bin with competencies and scaffolding. Quality committees, I think we need to get rid of those as well. Okay? They need to go. Oh! Thank you. Administrators who attempt to tame and ring-binder learning. Do you have that here? I don't understand why we have administrators who are not academics, who tell us how we should teach and get students to learn. I don't get that. I think we need to get rid of that as well. And I think the other thing we need to be aware of is accountability and performativity that masquerades as good practice. So I think some of the things that if we're moving into the 21st century properly, this is the kind of stuff we should be dealing with. We can do lots of interesting things in our classroom, but we need to fight the systems that impose things on us that we don't necessarily want. And so I'm just going to play you this little clip, I hope, if it will play like this. And then I've just got a slide which asks for some more questions. Okay.
Albert Einstein famously remarked in a conversation with Werner Heisenberg, he said, you know, in the West we've built a beautiful ship and in it it has all the comforts, but actually the one thing that it doesn't have is a compass, and that's why it doesn't know where it's going. This paradox of our times was propounded by the Dalai Lama when he said we have wider freeways but narrower viewpoints, we have taller buildings but shorter tempers. Will Smith said that we spend money we haven't earned on things we don't need to impress people we don't like. And it's phenomenal how the same technology that brings us close to those who are far away takes us far away from the people that are actually close. 30 billion WhatsApp messages are sent per day, but 48% of people say that they feel lonelier in general. The paradox of our times is that we have more degrees but less sense, more knowledge but less judgment, more experts but less solutions. It was Martin Luther King who said that the irony of our times is that we have guided missiles but misguided men. Have you ever found it perplexing that we've been all the way to the moon and back, but we struggle to start a conversation across the road or across the train? And it's amazing that Bill Gates was known as the top earner in 2015 with a wealth of 79.2 billion, but 1 in 4 CEOs claim to be struggling from depression. Do we actually thrive off this paradox? Is it that this paradox actually makes the media interesting? It's what makes journalism interesting. It's what makes politics interesting. It's what makes television interesting. Is this paradox actually what we feed off and what we live off and what we talk about and discuss in our circles? Doesn't it seem that we've tried to clean the air but polluted our soul? We've split the atom but not our prejudice, and we're aiming for higher incomes but we have lower morals. So I'm hearing you ask, how do we bring a change? How do we dissect this paradox that exists in our lives? And it starts by us, each of us, pressing pause, pressing reset, and then pressing play again, taking a moment to become more conscious, taking a moment to become more aware, taking a moment to really reflect on the consequence, the implications of a misplaced word, of an unnecessary argument that we all know we didn't need to have, or to speak to someone just slightly differently, in a different tone, in a different voice, in a different empathy, with a different perspective, just to really connect with people on a different level. This thinking out loud started from Albert Einstein, and I'll track back to him when he actually said that the problems we have today can't be solved with the same thinking we used when we once created them. So actually we need to research alternative teachings. We need to dig into those ancient books of wisdom. We need to go back to understanding if there's anything written in those creased pages of time that can actually reveal more knowledge and more wisdom of how we can transform our experience of life today. Otherwise, this paradox means that every step forward we take, we're taking 3 backwards every time.
Okay, now I've said a lot of stuff. I want you to turn to the person next to you and reflect on what I've said and come up with a question. Okay, can I stop you now? Whew. Fabulous amount of noise. Okay, Nikolai is going to wander around with the microphone. So, who's got a question? Oh, you're going to do a lot of running, Nikolai. Oh, there's somebody over there. Thank you.
What's your view on flipped classroom?
I think flipped classrooms are the same as problem-based learning by a sexier name.
I thought you didn't like the recording of the lecture and the reuse.
Well, I didn't say that. I just said we need to rethink what we do. I think if you use flipped classroom, for me a lot of flipped classroom is based on the old Oxbridge model, where you do a lot of reading before you come to the seminar and then you debate it. And I think that's a good thing for students. I don't have a problem with that. It's the repetition. Same old, same old. There's 1 here, 2 up there.
We were talking about the tunnel from the point of view, from our point of view as teachers. How does that tunnel look? How can we go into that with our own teaching practice? And how do we create the possibility for the students to go into the learning tunnel? More concretely, do you have any comments on that?
Given that I'm only just fiddling around with it, I haven't got an awful lot to say on that. I think when we get stuck ourselves with something like, how do I teach this better? I mean, I was just looking at these, podcasting or being transgressive or teaching creatively. I think they're kind of things that if we're challenged about, well, how can I do my teaching better or differently, that's the start for me, for ourselves. I think with students, I think it's quite easy to recognise, because it's usually when they get cross or frustrated or they blame you or they blame the method of learning, and that's when I think it's great if you can say that, there's been some work done on this and it's called disjunction, and, this is the right... I mean, I've written some other stuff about 2008, which is like the liminal tunnel, but I guess I didn't use that language then. I don't know where to start. It's 1, 2, 3. You take it and then maybe pass it back to the lady behind.
You said that maybe PBL wasn't enough anymore. And it sort of got us thinking, well, was it then ever enough?
Did I say PBL wasn't enough? I don't remember saying PBL wasn't enough. I said modules weren't enough.
Okay, but you said something like something about the digital tethering, challenging the suitability of PBL. That maybe thinking just in terms of strict PBL wasn't.
I was saying we need to include more things in it.
Yeah.
So things like virtual worlds, podcasts. I mean, you're probably doing all that really already, but I think it's about actually having depth and breadth together in the digital realm. That's all I'm saying.
We were talking about rethinking the whole lecture thing and rethinking how we're teaching them. But shouldn't we then also start rethinking how we examine our students? Because we might be stuck there more than we are in the actual classroom.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the starting place for any kind of change in a curriculum for me is the assessment. And that's where I think you need to think about how you assess your students. I used to try and be as subversive as possible. I got my master's students assessing a piece of cheese and designing assessment criteria, using it on the piece of cheese, and then developing assessment criteria for their own essays, and then marking each other's work. And that counted for 40% of the mark. That was the rule within the university. I couldn't take it any higher. But I think that creative way of including that, and it fits better with PBL, I think. Okay, there was somebody at the back, a couple of people at the back that didn't. I don't know how. You need numbers.
Thank you so far. You talked about, I was looking into the bin and you were throwing competence out. And that's okay by me. I do not have any personal relation to competences. But before we are taking on capabilities, we need to know what is the definition of capabilities in this frame.
You do, and it depends whose work that you go for. I would always go for Ron Barnett's stuff on capabilities and his arguments about competencies. There's a whole literature and all of this, so I could do another whole lecture on that. But that's where I suggest you would start.
Yeah, in PBL, it seems that one of the prime advantages is access to an experienced researcher. The students meet teacher learning space where they interact with a guy who is on a different level and can provide inputs. So the core of PBL is actually, or might be access to a researcher. You're spending time, you're meeting them in eye height, the students. One worry is that here in Denmark we are cutting down the resources for teaching, the hours that we get for PBL teaching students. We should be more efficient. So what is the chance of continuing with the PBL system but with less resources? Do you see any solution to this, a way to make it more efficient?
I'm not a fan of efficiency, to be quite honest. I think it should be in the bin with some of the other stuff. I think what we should be talking about is effective learning. But I think one of the things that we're very good at forgetting as academics is, I don't know about you, but when my printer breaks, I find a YouTube video. You know, when there's something that I can't fix, I find a YouTube video. And I think one of the things that we need to recognise more is there's an awful lot of stuff out there on the internet that we're not using, whether it's in MOOCs or whether it's in TED Talks. Now, it may not be the best information, but I think if you say to students, well, what have you found? And they said, well, I found this MOOC and this TED Talk. And then you say, well, how good is it? What do you all think about it? That's a really good space to use resources differently in PBL. There's a couple of people at the back. And I think... Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question concerning one of all the exciting concepts that you present. You mentioned this point going from the cognitive level to the more ontological level. Could you explicate more what your point is?
My point is that the threshold concepts literature has been very focused on cognitive psychology. The focus on the concepts has been actual concepts, not about personal transformation. And therefore, for me, the threshold concepts literature didn't go far enough initially. There is more now, and it does do that more. But for me, it's about making sure that it's all linked together. So it's just not trying to understand what pain is in your head. It's about understanding the value of pain as a runner in terms of, you know, telling you how it's going to affect your life and what it's going to mean.
In terms of the experience and
Yeah.
the practical situations. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, okay.
What would be, in your opinion, the best way of assessment of students?
Sorry, where am I looking? I can't see.
I'm here.
Oh, thank you. I was watching the microphone over there.
What is the best way of assessment of students, in your opinion, to avoid cheating and using devices?
To avoid cheating using devices. One of the things that I've done with my students, and they kind of hated me for it, was that I'd say, right, well, at the end of the problem-based learning module, there are going to be here are 5 essay questions that you're going to do in exam conditions without your phone, okay? But I'm only going to ask you to write 3 of these, okay? Or maybe even 1. So they got the questions in advance, but they didn't know which one they were going to get. Okay, so that helps. I've got lots of others, but leave it for now. Somebody at the
Thank you. It's the question about the future inspired us very much, and so did the video. And I think it's a big question if we have a future. I think that the lack of resources and the way we share power, and I think that the future depends very much about if we have critical, reflective, active and revolutionary students who take a stand. And it was actually what happened when Aau University started, and young people and engineers are very engaged in creating windmills, and the windmill power industry is very much dependent on young people who decided to build the first and the biggest windmill in the world, and maybe we've forgotten that history. So I think we should go more back to our roots and learn our students to take a stand and not just learn to defy predefined problem.
Yeah, but I think the lecturers should be doing it as well.
Sure.
Okay.
Oh wow, it's on. Anyway, so we were talking about, well, I'm not supposed to use the word competence, I guess, social...
You can use it.
Well, I won't use it then. I'll use social, it's capability then. It's just that I'm supervising undergraduate projects, 6th semester undergraduate projects, and one day the student said, well, we have a feeling that we're not spending our time very well. We sit for days and we don't get anywhere. And then I discovered that they had no plan of work, and they had no such thing as structured meetings or structured decision making at all. No wonder they weren't getting anywhere in the projects. And we just thought that that's a kind of social, when we talk about PBL at this university, we tend to think of projects carried out by groups of students. So there's some kind of social competence. Oh, sorry, didn't mean that. Social capability involved in all this. And I think this is important to PBL. How do you feel about that?
How do I feel about...
I mean, the importance of these social whatever.
Well, I think it goes back to how you equip your students to work in project and problem-based learning in the first place. And I do think, you know, that we need to educate our students at the outset of the course, and we need to put them in lots of different groups. And I mean, I think there are all sorts of crazy things you can do. Like you bring actors in who disrupt the group and cause problems, and get them to think about those kind of things. So I think for me, the best way to learn about group work is in group work, and not to solve it for them, which is the huge temptation. You know, again, I had a problem-based learning group in about 1980. A2 came to me and said, the group's not working. And I said, so what are you going to do about it? And they said, well, we want you to fix it. And I went, well, that's not my job, you know. So, I mean, I think there is that sense about, well, you know, do they know anything about how groups work? Do they understand anything about group theory? Have they dealt with difficult situations? I mean, I've even run scenarios, problem-based scenarios, where I've given them, the groups, a problem about a group, you know. So, and that just makes them think about, well, how do we want this group to work? And what are the issues for us? I don't know if that's any help, but that's the kind of stuff I've done.
Okay, yeah. Well, there are two kinds of group theory. Anyway.
Only two?
No, there's a one in algebra and there's one in pedagogy. Sorry.
And then there's somebody else.
So thank you very much, Maggie. I wonder whether our, especially our Western societies, suffer tremendously from a focus on the success of the individual and the direction of the individual in terms of, you know, knowledge acquisition and then success in their future life and all that. And whether it's necessary to rethink and redefine what kind of competencies future generations really need, for instance, in regards to knowledge ownership and the responsibilities of knowledge ownership. So, in theory, problem-based learning and project-based, you know, group-based work has the potential for that. But I wonder why we are still failing in to achieve, you know, this knowledge sharing, this perhaps more, you know, taking on responsibilities for the community. And what we should change in the approach that we are taking. I don't know if that's clear enough.
I think for me, what the first problem relates to our assessment, because our assessments are so individual, and the grades that students get are always individual, and therefore that's what they strive for, because we encourage them to look after themselves. I don't know if it's happening in Denmark, but in the UK we're seeing a shift in the 16 to 18-year-old population in terms of their stance towards learning and knowledge and society. So a huge amount of them, there was uproar that they didn't get to vote in Brexit because it affected their future more than the 70-year-olds who were voting. So that was one. We're also seeing a shift in students not necessarily going to the top universities because they don't agree with the fee structure and they don't agree with the elitism. So students who are perfectly capable of going to the top universities are actually making decisions to come to places like Worcester and some of the other universities because it's about the values. So I'm encouraged. Now, it's only small, but I think it gives hope. You know, students who use their time to go and work in food banks, they choose to do that.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk, Maggie. I have two questions. One, I hope, is a fairly short one. I was wondering about your list of words to be aware of, or concepts to be aware of. And I was thinking about evidence, because there's a Danish education researcher, Per Vibeke Larsen, has just written a book where he is warning a bit, I mean, he's concerned about and saying to be aware of evidence for learning. So I'm wondering if that's one of the words on your list. And then inspired by Catherine's question before, and because I've been doing an awful lot of work in Africa on problem-based learning, what about the cultural context? I would really love to hear your perception of what impact does the cultural context have on problem-based learning? Is it a universal approach? Or am I just stupid when I say that problem-based learning must be the very right thing for Africa because that's where the problems are?
I think the evidence is probably too big a question to tackle. I think one of the problems we've got is evidence-based, research-based. I think they're concepts that need to be looked at. I think there is some use in some of this stuff. But I don't think we should constantly have to be proving ourselves on every single thing the whole time. In terms of the cultural stuff, I work in, this is a joke from, we were talking about this over dinner, I'm an extraordinary professor at the University of Stellenbosch, which I think is the best title in the world you could have, to be an extraordinary professor. You're supposed to laugh now. I think it's very funny. But so I go regularly across to Cape Town, and so it works very well in the universities that I've worked in Cape Town. I did a small project getting students to look at conservation in Zambia with children who didn't even have a pencil. So we used problem-based learning there to get them to learn about conservation and the elephants and elephant tracks and stuff. So that worked there. I think my experiences of Singapore and Korea in particular is that the problem-based learning seems to be a bit more knowledge-based. Constellation 1, much more linear and guided. We do think there are huge differences, and I think it's the same in a lot of places I've been to in the States. It's quite linear and managed and scaffolded. So I do think there are cultural differences, but I haven't written a book on that.
Okay. Time is about to be up, so I would like to say thank you very much for your lovely presentation.
Thank you. And thanks for great questions. Give me some thinking to do on the way home.